Well, hello, this is Dr. E again. We're now going to have a chapter on biomolecules and biochemistry, a topic that is dear to me. In fact, I did my doctoral work in this field. Now, we've just had a couple of chapters on the cell and strategies for life. So we're now going to go smaller, and we're going to talk about the molecules of life, the molecules that carry out the processes needed for life. And we will see that the components of living cells are constructed from a relatively few number of simple molecular building blocks. It's amazing how complex the range of biomolecules is, but that they're all made of a relatively few number of building blocks. And then towards the end of this chapter, we will see that these molecules can carry out a very intricate and coordinated set of reactions producing life and also enabling the reproduction of cells. Before leaving this slide, I wanted to point out the two molecules shown. The one on the left you would probably recognize as DNA with its double helix, and it's sort of drawn in a very artful way. The one on the right is a protein, and it is a protein that happens to have a high content of alpha helix. Those are those curlicue things, just to give you some idea of what proteins and nucleic acids look like. Now, this slide just shows you the broad range of life forms. At the top left, we have a influenza virus, and then simple bacteria, and then as we go towards the right in the slide, we see a variety of different life forms, to the giant sequoia to the blue whale, some of the largest organisms on planet Earth. But the point is that even though there is a very diverse range of life forms, they're made from this surprisingly similar set of molecules. This slide focuses on the elemental composition of living systems, not necessarily molecules, but the elements. What elements are life forms made of? And as you can see in the table, life forms are made of oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur. That is, these dozen or so elements comprise living systems. Even though we have over 100 elements in the periodic table, living systems utilize only a certain set of these elements. By mass, oxygen comprises the largest percentage of living systems, and that is largely because about 60% of our bodies, for example, is water. And if you remember, water is H2O, two hydrogens and an oxygen. So it shouldn't be too surprising that oxygen is 65% of the mass of our bodies is made of the element oxygen. Then we have carbon. Now, carbon is a very important player. In fact, we say that living systems are organic, based on organic chemistry, which is a reflection of the importance of the element carbon. As you may remember from earlier lessons, carbon is very good at playing covalent chemistry, that is, forming covalent bonds with other elements, in particular covalent bonds with other carbon atoms, with hydrogen, with oxygen, with nitrogen, with sulfur. And as a result, carbon can form large polymeric molecules, and we will see examples of these in just a minute when we talk about the important groups of biomolecules. So the point is that most of our bodies are made of oxygen, carbon, and then hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and so forth and so on. And you can see the little description of the man, and that mostly he's up to his hips and his arms and his shoulders, and oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen, and then a few other things. Now, there are four main types of biological macromolecules that are found in all life forms. By macromolecule, we mean large molecules formed by the polymerization of different building blocks together, different monomeric groups together to form polymers. We've talked about polymers before. But these four main types of biological macromolecules are proteins, which we'll talk about in this lesson, nucleic acids, including DNA and RNA, which we've already talked about, and we won't include too much about DNA and RNA in this chapter. But then we have polysaccharides, which can also be called carbohydrates, and fats or lipids. Each of these main categories are large molecules made by assembling smaller components together. And we'll talk about in this chapter proteins, polysaccharides, and fats or lipids. In addition, other important components of living systems are water, as we said, 60% of our mass is water, various minerals such as calcium, magnesium, ions, sodium ion, potassium ion, chloride ion, carbonate, phosphate, which are needed for nerve conduction and in communication between cells, gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide, and other various small molecules. One that we will talk about is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It is an important intermediary energy molecule that is produced as a result of metabolism. Amino acids, glucose itself, and other small monosaccharides, and vitamins. All of these are examples of the small molecules that also play an important role in biochemistry. Now in this chapter we're going to talk a little bit about proteins. Proteins again are macromolecules or polymers, and in the top right and the bottom I show two different depictions of proteins. Now proteins are so large that we often don't even show all of the atoms, and in the upper right we show what is called a ribbon structure for a protein, where we actually don't show the atoms but we show the backbone as a chain or a ribbon, because showing all the atoms would just make it look like a blob. What is important for you to know is that all of the proteins that we will talk about are made of 20 common amino acids. Now when we say common, we mean that they are used to make the proteins in all life forms, from the smallest virus to the largest animals and humans. We all use the same 20 common amino acids. It's like using the same letters in an alphabet to make the sentences. In this case, it's amino acids being linked together to form proteins. Now, proteins perform a variety of functions inside and outside of cells, whereas DNA is the information molecule or the blueprint molecule. It is a blueprint molecule for the production of proteins, and it's actually the proteins that are the worker bees. Or they're the little machines that carry out a variety of functions needed for life. Now, among these functions are to be a transporter or a carrier, that is, to carry molecules around through our body. Examples of this that you no doubt have heard of are hemoglobin in our blood, hemoglobin, and also the sodium potassium ATPase, which moves molecules from one side to the other of cell. So in general, one category are carriers or transporters. A second category of proteins are those which are enzymes. Now, enzymes catalyze chemical reactions. Catalyze means speed up chemical reactions. They make the reactions go faster, and sometimes they control whether or not they take place at all. We will see later that metabolism involves an array of interconnected chemical reactions, and each of these must be catalyzed by an enzyme, which speeds up the reaction so that they work in concert. A couple of enzymes are lysozyme and nuclease. Another category of proteins are those which are hormones. Probably the most familiar example here would be insulin. Insulin is actually a protein that serves as a hormone. Proteins can also serve a structural role, and I give three examples: collagen, spectrin, and keratin. Collagen is the protein found in cartilage, and at the bottom drawing on this slide actually is a depiction of collagen, which is three strands. It's like a long rope or fiber with three strands wrapped around each other. Spectrin is a protein inside living cells that forms what is called a cytoskeleton. That is, it gives internal structure to cells. And keratin is a protein that we find in our hair, in our fingernails, and it's also the main component of spider web. So it is a structural protein as well. Another category of proteins are those that provide defense. Immunoglobulins are what we sometimes call antibodies. That is, in our immune system, we make proteins that protect us against invading molecules. Very important function. Proteins also serve a mechanical function. The two most important here are myosin and actin. Now, myosin and actin are both long filaments. Filament means something like a rope that will slide past each other when our muscles contract. Now, to move these two filaments past each other requires energy. That energy comes from ATP, and the ATP, as we will see, is produced as a result of metabolism. So all of this works together. Proteins can also be receptors. That is, they can receive signals when something binds to them or interacts with them. So among the receptors are the acetylcholine receptor, which is involved in nerve conduction. Rhodopsin is another receptor which absorbs photons in our rods and cones. And when rhodopsin absorbs photons, it triggers the nerve impulse that leads to vision. So receptors bind or interact with other things externally and trigger certain events within cells or between cells. So these are some general categories of the functions of proteins. Proteins, again, the functional molecules in our bodies. Now, this slide gives a depiction of how an enzyme works. And if you look at the drawing to the left, again, this is a ribbon drawing of a protein. This protein happens to be lysozyme. We show only a ribbon drawing sometimes because showing all the atoms becomes very complicated, as I said earlier. And in the middle drawing, the atoms are shown. So you can see it sort of looks like a glob if you draw everything. But what is pointed out is that in an enzyme there is what we call an active site. An active site into which something called a substrate will bind. And the substrate in the drawing to the right is drawn as yellow. So a substrate will bind into this active site. Now the function of an enzyme is to speed up reactions. And so when this substrate is in the active site, something can happen that causes a reaction to occur with this substrate, either to convert it to another molecule or to split it in half or to join molecules together. Now oftentimes we visualize this as sort of a chomping down on the substrate as shown in the right. And it's not necessarily a chomping of physical force, but it is essentially a chemical type of chomping where the electron distribution in the active site of the enzyme induces chemical reactions by essentially pushing around electrons in the substrate to either cause bonds to be formed or broken within that substrate. Okay, we're going to pause as we do and ask you to answer a few questions, and then we'll continue on to the second lesson in this chapter on biomolecules and biochemistry.